Okay, the comparative study of the Sudarium of Oviedo and the Shroud of Turin by Guillermo Jerez Moreno, civil engineer, head of the investigation team of the Spanish Center for Sindonology, and others, translated from Spanish. This was published in 1998 by the Internazionale Congresso Internazionale di Studi sulle Sindone, Turin, 5th to 7th of June 1998. This is a fascinating document, and I'll put the link to where I found it. It's a PDF file. Introduction. Since Monsignor Giuliano Ricci first strongly suggested in 1985 that the cloth venerated in Oviedo, known as the Sudarium of Oviedo and the Shroud of Turin, had really been used on the same corpse, the separate study of each cloth has advanced greatly according to the terminology with which scientific method can approach this hypothesis in this day and age. The paper called the Sudarium of Oviedo and the Shroud of Turin, Two Complementary Relics, was read at the Cagliari Congress on dating the shroud in 1990. This present paper can be considered the second part of that one. Great steps forward have been taken in all the scientific fields that were only beginning for us in 1990. We cannot explain here all the new discoveries about the Sudarium made since 1990. Most of it has been published in the Book of Acts of the First International Congress on the Sudarium of Oviedo, held in Oviedo in 1994. Well aware of the lack of knowledge about this cloth, following are the conclusions published in our recent study in Biblia y Fe, number 71, entitled The Historical Jesus, the Sudarium of Oviedo. These conclusions are as follows. According to the account of the Bishop Pelagius, the Sudarium left Jerusalem in the Holy Ark, or chest, in the year AD 614, under the name of Sudarium Domini, the Sudarium of the Lord. According to this document, tradition associates the cloth with the Sudarium of Jesus of Nazareth and no other person. It should be pointed out that there are 600 undocumented years in the history of the cloth. If this cloth is in effect the Sudarium of Jesus of Nazareth, it must have been kept somewhere from when it was used up to AD 614 when it left Palestine, but nothing is known for sure about those years. The historical investigation on the cloth has just begun, trying to shed some light on the situation. However, it should be pointed out that the information the cloth contributes to understanding the death of the man whose head it covered is awful and shocking. The picture of a corpse hanging on a cross with blood coming out of its nose and mouth must have been truly horrible, especially thinking of the ancient Jews. It is therefore understandable that if a cloth were used to cover up Jesus' face when he was still on the cross, no mention would be made of it, as it would bring back the memory of that terrible moment. In other words, the idea of the dead body of Jesus of Nazareth bleeding through the nose and mouth was impossible to describe for a Jew. This could be an indirect explanation of why the cloth's existence was kept silent up until the time it left Jerusalem. The medieval interest in relics gave rise to the only documents found up to now that speak of the present and past of this cloth. It should be said that, in our investigation, we have found nothing to contradict this tradition, except the carbon-14 dating ordered by Professor Baima Bologna. According to this experiment, the cloth dates from the 7th century. Baima Bologna himself says the results should not be given undue importance, but is the first contrary information obtained. It's also important from the point of view of liturgy that the cloth has always been venerated. In our opinion, this veneration has been, and still is, something exceptional compared to that of other relics. The Good Friday blessing, one of the most important in the Catholic liturgy, is given with the Sudarium. This means that its authenticity has never been in doubt. It even had its own Mass up until the 17th century, when it was suspended despite the pleas of the Bishop of Oviedo in 1640. The reasons for the suppression of the Mass are unknown, although it could have had something to do with the confusion of the word Sudarium, sometimes applied to the shroud also. The shroud has had its own mass since 1506, approved by Pope Julius II. It could have been considered the true Sudarium rather than the one in Oviedo, whose only value was that of tradition, as it was impossible to identify with something related to a human being, even less to Jesus of Nazareth. As a summary of the results obtained up to now from the forensic, geometrical, and mathematical studies carried out by the EDICES group, the following can be confidently stated. 1. The Sudarium of Oviedo is a relic, which has been venerated in the Cathedral of Oviedo for a very long time. It contains stains formed by human blood of the blood group AB. The cloth is dirty, creased, torn, and burnt in parts, stained, and highly contaminated. It does not, however, show signs of fraudulent manipulation. It seems to be a funeral cloth that was probably placed over the head of a corpse of an adult male of normal constitution. The man whose face the Sudarium covered had a beard, a mustache, and long hair, tied up at the nape of his neck into a ponytail. The man's mouth was closed, his nose was squashed and forced to the right by the pressure of holding the cloth to his face. Both these anatomical elements have been clearly identified on the Sudarium of Oviedo. The man was dead. The mechanism that formed the stains is incompatible with any kind of breathing movement. The bottom at the back of his head there's a series of wounds produced in life by some sharp instrument. These wounds had bled about an hour before the cloth was placed on top of them. Just about the entire head, shoulders, and at least part of the back of the man were covered in blood before being covered by this cloth. This is known because it's impossible to reproduce the stains in the hair, on the forehead, and on the top of the head with blood from a corpse. It can therefore be stated that the man was wounded before death with something that made his scalp bleed and produced wounds on his neck, shoulders, and upper part of his back. Number 9. The man suffered a pulmonary edema as a consequence of the terminal process. Number 10. The cloth was placed over the head, starting from the back, held to the hair by sharp objects. From there it went round the left side of the head to the right cheek, where, for apparently unknown reasons, it was folded over onto itself, ending up folded like an accordion at the left cheek. It's possible that the cloth was placed like this because the head formed an obstacle and so was folded over onto itself. On placing the cloth in this position, two stained areas can be anatomically observed, one over the ponytail and the other over the top of the back. Once the man had died, the corpse stayed in a vertical position for about 1 hour, and the right arm was raised with the head bent 70 degrees forward and 20 degrees to the right. How can this be reasonably thought of as a vertical position? If the man of the Oviedo Sudarium was hanging by the right arm only, then the rest of the body, especially the head, would be relatively far from this arm, hanging to the left. This position is incompatible with that of the head that the cloth wrapped. It is therefore easy to deduce that the body was hanging by both arms. But if the body was hanging like this, without support from the feet, the man would have died in 15 or 20 minutes, and there would not have been enough time to generate the amount of liquid necessary to form the stains visible on the cloth. If the body were hanging with both arms above the head, then the head would have been leaning forward and not to the right. So the only position compatible with the formation of the stains on the Oviedo cloth is both arms outstretched above the head and the feet in such a position as to make breathing very difficult, i.e. a position totally compatible with crucifixion. We can say that the man was wounded first, blood on the head, shoulders, and back, and then crucified. The body was placed on the ground on its right side with the arms in the same position and the head still bent 20 degrees to the right and at 115 degrees from the vertical position. The forehead was placed on a hard surface, and the body was left in this position for approximately 1 more hour. The body was then moved while somebody's left hand in various positions tried to stem the flow of liquid from the nose and mouth, pressing strongly against them. This movement could have taken about 5 minutes. The cloth was folded over itself all of this time. The cloth was then straightened out and wrapped all around the head like a hood, held on again by sharp objects. This allowed part of the cloth, folded like a cone, to fall over the back. With the head thus covered, the corpse was held up partly by a left fist. The cloth was then moved sideways over the face in this position. Thus, once the obstacle, which could have been the hair matted with blood or the head bent towards the right, had been removed, the cloth covered the entire head, and the corpse was moved for the last time face down on a closed left fist. This movement produced the large triangular stain on whose surface the finger-shaped stains can be seen, and on the reverse side of the cloth the curve inscribed on the cheek. Like the previous movement, this one could have taken 5 minutes at most. Finally, on reaching the destination, the body was placed face up, and for unknown reasons, the cloth was taken off the head. Possibly myrrh and aloes were then sprinkled over the cloth. Taking these results into account, it's easy to understand the most important conclusion of the International Congress on the Sudarium of Oviedo, which took place in said city in 1994. The aim of this paper is to communicate to investigators and students of the Shroud one step more of the data and results that coincide for both cloths. Section 2. Approach to the problem. Even though it might seem needless to say it, we have to begin with what we have. We have 2 archaeological objects, 2 linen cloths. Each has been described by its respective specialists. The possibility that the shroud is the funeral cloth of Jesus of Nazareth mentioned in the canonical and apocryphal Gospels has been analyzed, as had the possibility that the Sudarium of Oviedo is the Sudarium mentioned by said Gospels, and that the Gospel of John as being present in the tomb of Jesus on the morning of the appearance to Mary Magdalene. Information both for and against both cloths has been coldly and scientifically evaluated. Our conclusion from this is that in both cases it seems much more possible that the cloths are genuine than the opposite. This opinion is based on the joint consideration of all the information we have. We should also remember that the investigation is open. Not all the possible studies have been carried out on the shroud. For example, more analysis and recent result treatment is possible. Some of the basic studies on the Sudarium have yet to be done. The historical study and an analysis of the textile to date the cloth. We think there's more to discover than is already known. It is not easy to obtain and assimilate the information contained in the cloths. Just about every study method has to be designed just for the tests that need to be done. It's clear that when one leaves the established routine in any field of investigation, a specific methodology has to be drawn up for the case in question. This means a higher possibility of making mistakes on analyzing samples and establishing hypotheses about the results obtained. These results have to be contrasted in order to be sure that what has been obtained can be accepted. All of this means slowness. Our team started work almost 10 years ago, and we are still at the beginning. We would like to make it clear that the authors of this paper have not seen the shroud and have not had the chance to study it firsthand. Consequently, what we're about to say about geometrical comparisons can only be taken as second-hand information, rigorous, but not a contrasted result. Working with photographs can lead to significant mistakes despite having John Jackson in our team and therefore having first-hand information. No result of the geometrical study that follows can be taken as definitive or conclusive. It is a continuation of similar work started many years ago. Having said this, and before referring to any properties of the shroud image, we should say that we do not know how this image was formed. As the image is the essential element for our comparison, it should be stated before starting that the bloodstains visible on the face of the shroud image were produced in 3 spatial dimensions and are not centered when the shroud is flattened out. The farther the stain in question is from the center of the face, the more it is off-center, which is why the stains from the forehead are seen in the hair. This is a consequence of the shroud's flattening out on collapsing through the body, according to Jackson's theory. However, the dorsal image was not formed in the same way as the frontal image. This means that the bloodstains on the dorsal image are not displaced, and therefore are the results of this comparison with the Sudarium of Oviedo is not the same as the aforementioned point. Consequently, the image of the face of the shroud and the one that can be obtained from the Sudarium cannot coincide on one level, although if both were used on the same corpse, they should have the same elements and characteristics that will enable us to establish a link between the same elements on each head. Section 3. Geometrical comparison of the Sudarium and the shroud. We will begin the comparison saying that from the point of view of textiles, the Oviedo cloth is linen, perpendicular in warp and weft. This pattern is called taffeta. The shroud is linen with a herringbone weave. Microscopically, both cloths have the same thickness and the same number of threads per surface unit. In spite of both being made of linen and having the same microscopic structure, the difference between a taffeta and the shroud weave shows that the Oviedo cloth is coarser and was probably meant for domestic use, as well as a cloth for drying sweat, of course, or for wearing on the head according to the customs of the time. The herringbone weave was much more expensive than anything to be found in Jerusalem. It normally came from Syria, more specifically from the oases around the city of Palmyra, as we were told at the Rockefeller Institute of Jerusalem. The Gospels tell us that the shroud in which the corpse of Jesus of Nazareth was wrapped was bought by Joseph of Arimathea, a rich and influential man. The silence about the Sudarium could have something to do with its use and the circumstances in which it was used. From the Roman point of view, it seems that no cloth was normally used to cover the face of crucified people. The dead bodies were normally thrown into a common grave with no kind of ceremony, as crucifixion was reserved for crimes like high treason or military rebellion, and even then never for Roman citizens. On the other hand, in Jewish crucifixions, it was normal to give a drugged drink to the criminal or water to relieve his thirst, as the torment could then last longer, and it was also customary to cover the face of the corpse when it became disfigured. This was done by pious Jews who were present at the crucifixion. This situation could have changed completely when Pilate gave permission to take the body away. The sight of the bleeding corpse with a disfigured face and pulmonary edema liquid coming out of the nose and mouth should have been enough to warrant the use of a cloth to cover the face, in accordance with the general instructions about blood in the Pentateuch and the specific instructions of the Sanhedrin. It was also absolutely necessary to stem the blood flow, as for a Jew, the presence of blood was unbearable and should be avoided. Anything stained with blood should be buried with the corpse. From a geometrical point of view, we can compare the head of the man on the shroud with that of the man on the Sudarium, since, as we have already stated, the Oviedo cloth was used to wrap a human head. The process that killed the men on the cloths should also be compared from a forensic point of view. Thirdly, both heads left bloodstains on their respective cloths. This is a double comparison, the geometry of the stains and the blood itself. With the intention of following a chronological order as close to what actually happened as possible, we should mention first of all the already cited works of Ricci for the International Congress on the Sudarium of Oviedo and his studies previously published in the book L'uomo della Sudone e Gesù. His first findings on the Oviedo cloth are published in this book. He gives an acceptable macroscopic overlay of the part we have called the obverse left, with the face of the shroud image. Ricci draws our attention to various points. The first characteristic element that caught my attention in September 1965 was a blood stain that I had observed some months previously on the right-hand side of the mouth on the man on the shroud. As we can see, Ricci refers to the first time he examined the Oviedo cloth. At that time, nobody knew how this particular stain had been produced. Today, we know it is human blood of group AB on both cloths. Ricci continues, I should point out that it was and is difficult to see this stain on normal photographs of the shroud. 2 years later, in 1967, I sent up one of the photos taken by Henry, official shroud photographer, in 1931 to Dr. John Jackson. He returned an enhancement of this photograph which supports this hypothesis, deduced from a simple axiometric study of the sardonic face, and which permitted me to focus better on the right side of the mouth, whose interpretation is unclear in normal photos of the face. With this method, a clotted blood flow was visible all over the beard. This was not seen on the left-hand side of the mouth. This particular observation, unknown at the time to shroud studies, gained more credit when a later study was carried out on the movements of the shroud man on the cross. His first movement was from a position of leaning forward to lifting himself up with a relative movement to the right, enabling the man to speak, and precisely when he was leaning to the right, blood came out of the right-hand side of his mouth. Ricci says then that after the movements on the cross had been studied, two became clear. First, the man leaned forward, and then lifted himself upwards and to the right. We do not agree with Ricci about the blood that came out of the right-hand side of the mouth. We think it is post-mortem blood that was shed after death. It is a significant coincidence that the relative position of the stain in relation to the mouth is very similar on both cloths. But we should also point out that the angle formed by this stain in relation to the average horizontal plane of the mouth is approximately 115 degrees. This angle is formed on bending the head towards the right. The angle as measured on the Oviedo cloth, unfolded on a flat surface, is around 119 degrees and around 110 degrees on the shroud. These results are geometrically coherent, bearing in mind that we do not know how the image on the shroud was formed. If we consider it a vertical projection from the corpse onto the cloth, which was Jackson's hypothesis, we should obtain a smaller angle, as it is a projection onto a surface whose curvature is lessening as the cloth collapses. The angle measured on the unfolded cloth should be slightly higher than the real one, as can easily be seen on any foldable surface. The angle formed by a plane defined by the axes of the mouth and the symmetrical axis of the blood stain with the horizontal plane when the image was formed is roughly 17 degrees, which is compatible with the first position of the shroud. As for the area of each blood stain, it is around 1,980 square millimeters on the Sudarium, 1,310 square meters on the shroud, which is coherent for the geometrical reasons already explained. The second detail that caught Ricci's attention was the left tip of the beard, which has more hair than the right one. The hair on the right tip seems to be less dense. This is true on the shroud, and something similar can be seen on the Oviedo cloth. Comparing the life-size photograph on the face of the shroud taken by Henry with the one I brought with me from Oviedo, and putting one on top of the other, I was taken aback by the perfect fit of the shroud image with the macroscopic Sudarium outline. In other words, the superimposition was clear, not only with the first element, the blood at the right-hand side of the mouth, by itself, but also with the second, i.e. the tip of the beard on the left. The same is also true for the right-hand side of the beard with less hair. It is the same on the Sudarium. This could be confirmation for the hypothesis that both the shroud and the Sudarium were placed on the same face. The following details should be noticed on analyzing this result. As we have just seen, Monsignor Ricci did nothing more than a macroscopic comparison between the part of the Sudarium he could see, which we have called the obverse left, with the image of the face of the shroud. If one sees the obverse of the Oviedo cloth with the naked eye without ever having carried out any microscopic studies, it could seem to be the part that was in direct contact with the face. It is also clear that Ricci discovered the symmetry between the two large stains on the obverse of the Sudarium, obverse left and obverse right, and at the same time showed that the cloth had been folded over onto itself. The problem is that it should be determined how the cloth was folded. According to our microscopic observation, there is no doubt as to which part of the cloth was in direct contact with the face of the corpse, the one we have called in all our work reverse left. The cloth was folded in such a way that the face stained this part directly, then the blood filtered through the obverse right and the obverse left, with the reverse right on the outside. This can be confirmed with no doubt at all for two specific reasons. All the reverse left is covered in blood, and there is much more hemetic substance on this part than any other. Secondly, the folded mark that defines how the cloth was folded is on the reverse and not on the obverse. So the part of the cloth that was in direct contact with the face is reverse left. The two interior stain groups are those on the obverse, and the outermost group is the one we've called reverse right. We would like to make an important observation about Ricci's work. On comparing the Sudarium with the Shroud of Turin, he chose the wrong area. This gave rise to a problem that Ricci could not solve: how to place the cloth correctly over the head it stained. Ricci makes some more comparisons between the cloths and finally concludes, "The key to reading this comparative study is the blood, the same as on the shroud. However, while the shroud, contrary to any work of art it has inspired over the centuries, enables us to reconstruct completely and almost descriptively each of the 5 phases of the passion of the man it wrapped, the Sudarium of Oviedo, as St. John suggested in his Gospel, was limited to the final phase of the crucifixion, i.e. the descent from the cross. It was a pious gesture to cover the disfigured face, stained by ecchymosis and abundant blood. The Sudarium's presence on his face is limited to the brief time necessary to take the dead body of the Lord from Calvary to the nearby tomb." We would like to reiterate the importance of Ricci's work. It is a milestone for any student of the Sudarium, and for us a pleasant memory. There will always be a before and after Ricci in the investigation of the Oviedo cloth. Now that we are presenting our work, as in all our expositions, we should make some things clear in order to avoid mistaken or simply confused interpretations. We have seen that Ricci compared the morphology and wounds on both faces by superimposing them on a flat surface. We too started our analysis in this way, and this is what was presented at the Cagliari Congress in 1990. But now is the time to take the study one step further. The comparison is valid to get a first idea and to draw attention to the similarities between the cloths. However, it cannot be more than a first idea, because the stains of the cloths do not necessarily have to coincide on a flat surface. Stains produced by the same face at different times can be in different positions that cannot be superimposed if the cloths are unfolded and spread out on a flat surface. Even then, the cloths would have to be placed very carefully and not be moved at all while the stains were being formed, and the exact method of stain transfer from the face to the cloth would have to be known. This is not the case here. Sideways movements of the forehead can be appreciated on the Oviedo cloth, so the same stain can be seen in different places. We've already mentioned the difficulties that arise when we try to compare the blood stains and image on the shroud. Without going into too much detail in this kind of consideration, it is enough to say that the same face can produce different stains, especially on different cloths, and different faces can produce very similar stains on different cloths. Thus, the comparative analysis on a flat surface can only give a basic idea of the study of the two faces. More information can be obtained from the study of whether quantifiable correspondence that can be evaluated in terms of geometric probability can be established for the cloths. As we have already said, we think that the part of the Sudarium that was in direct contact with the face was the one called reverse left, so we should be able to show the existence of certain coincidences between the following anatomical elements of the face of the man of the Sudarium and that of the man on the shroud. The nose, number 1. A total area of 2,280 square millimeters on the Sudarium and 2,000 square millimeters on the shroud. Number 2. The superciliary ridges. Number 3. Absence of a right cheekbone corresponding to the swelling observed in this area on the shroud. Number 4. Swelling on the right side of the nose, around 100 square millimeters on the Sudarium and around 90 square millimeters on the shroud. Number 5. The tip of the nose, nostrils, and nose wings. Number 6. The position and size of the mouth, especially the blood flow on the right-hand side, as already mentioned, first described by Ricci. Number 7. The chin. Number 8. The shape of the beard. If we then observe the front left quadrant of the man of the shroud and the front left quadrant of the Sudarium of Oviedo, we can see that there is an almost bi-unique correspondence between the position and size of the stains on each cloth. However, the ones on the Oviedo cloth occupy a greater area, as is geometrically to be expected, as the movement described by Jackson on describing the shroud image can be observed. The area of these stains is 686 square millimeters on the Sudarium and 528 square millimeters on the shroud, a coincidence of 80% on a flat surface, and 88 square millimeters on the Sudarium compared to 70 square millimeters on the shroud, with a sideways movement of around 2 centimeters, the stain on the Oviedo cloth being in a more external position. If we observe the right frontal area, we can see that the drop of blood over the left eyebrow is geometrically compatible with the stain in exactly the same area on the Sudarium. Both areas are 80 square millimeters, and the relative position is practically the same on both cloths. It is interesting to note that this stain can be seen in 2 positions on the Oviedo cloth, a clear sign that the cloth was moved sideways over the face. The correspondence between the blood stains on the 2 cloths is therefore acceptable in the areas where the face is seen from the front, and the same can be said for the marks or traces visible on each. This correspondence is evident with the size of the stains, their relative positions on each cloth, and their origin. If we observe the stains on the shroud face in detail, it seems they have been gently dragged to the right, which would fit in perfectly with the direction deduced and described above for the movement of the corpse of the man of the Sudarium of Oviedo. Summing up the coincidences between the bloodstains visible on each face, we can say that it's possible to establish correspondence in the following aspects. The size of the stains is geometrically compatible, as is the relative position on each cloth. The blood is human, of the group AB on both cloths. The stains formed by blood shed in life are the same on each cloth. The stains occupy the positions predictable from the formation of the shroud image, with the sideways movement discovered by Lavoie and accepted by Jackson. But the coincidences do not end here. Remember how the Sudarium was placed over the head that stained it. The first step was to fasten it to the back of the head and ponytail with sharp instruments, pins of bone or something similar. The cloth fell over the left shoulder and top of the back of the man in question and went round the left side of the face. The Oviedo cloth shows that all the area touched was completely covered in blood before blood came out of the dead body. This is a point of great correspondence between the 2 cloths, as the stains on the back of the head on the shroud coincide with those on the Sudarium in size, relative position, and origin, blood shed in life. And both cloths are blood-stained in all the parts that correspond to the left cheek. The stained areas on both cloths are 2,455 square millimeters for the shroud and 267 square millimeters on the Sudarium. It is practically possible to superimpose the area on the Sudarium with the corresponding stains on the shroud so that the cranial parabola already described in the Sudarium fits the same area on the dorsal image of the shroud, following the bloodstains. The bloodstains on the back of the man also correspond on the two claws. On the Oviedo cloth, they can be found in the lower left and right corners. Something else should be mentioned: the almost complete lack of movement when the images from the dorsal image of the shroud are compared to their counterparts on the Sudarium, which coincides with Jackson's theory about the image formation. Section 4. Forensic comparison. Were the two claws used on the same corpse? We now have to talk about the blood as a common element on both claws. We have already said that it is human blood of group AB in both cases. The definitive proof would be the DNA test on the claws, still pending due to the difficulties of working with old blood and the very low number of cells. Having reached this point, we can only repeat Ricci's question: were the claws used on the same body? Can we say that this body was that of Jesus of Nazareth? From the archaeological point of view, the claws of Oviedo and Turin have points in common as far as use is concerned, especially the following. From the point of view of textile study, there is nothing to eliminate the possibility that they existed together, except, of course, the carbon-14 results. 13th or 14th century for the shroud, 7th century for the Sudarium. There are many older linen cloths in existence. Number 2. From the forensic point of view, it is clear that the shroud wrapped the dead body of a man who had been whipped, crowned with thorns, and crucified. The Sudarium of Oviedo wrapped the head of a body whose death is perfectly compatible with crucifixion, and the wounds inflicted before death visible on the shroud. The two deaths are very similar. Number 3. The shroud wrapped the whole body, including the head. The Sudarium wrapped all of the head of a corpse and touched the shoulders, especially the left one, and the back slightly. The correspondence between the bloodstains on the cloths is practically bi-unique, i.e. each bloodstain has a corresponding stain on the other cloth as far as size and blood group is concerned, always bearing in mind, with the margin of error, that this correspondence is evident all around the head. The stains on the left side of the front show the sideways movement described by Jackson. The further stains are from the middle of the face, the more this movement can be seen. It should also be said that the blood stains on the head of the man of the shroud show signs of having been covered with another cloth. The specific nature of these stains and the relative position on the cloths coincide in such a way as to make it necessary to see on the shroud if the coincidence is also evident on the reverse side of each cloth. This would enable us to evaluate in terms of geometric probability the formation of the stains with the cloths unfolded on a flat surface. We could ask the following question: what is the probability that the two sets of stains formed at random at different times by different bodies could correspond to such an extent on a flat surface? Although we do not have the answer to this question yet, it is clear that the probability is very small. If we add to this the physical time involved, the formation mechanism of the stains, and historical conditions, we are left with only one possible answer. Everything seems to indicate that both claws wrapped the same body, and that this body was that of Jesus of Nazareth, a Jew crucified in Jerusalem under the Roman governor Pontius Pilate on the 3rd of April of the year 33 A.D., or the 7th of April, 30 A.D., at midday local time in a place called Golgotha. Despite the positive sound of this answer, we should remember what we said at the beginning of this brief geometrical presentation. The conclusion could be totally wrong and should be properly evaluated with studies on the shroud itself. Regardless of what has just been said, attention should be called to certain points which could go unnoticed, as for example, for some reason that is yet to be explained, the Sudarium of Oviedo was taken off the body whose head it had wrapped. The cloth was then kept and venerated. Tradition tells us that this is not unusual if the body in question was that of Jesus of Nazareth. As we know, he was wrapped in a shroud, and in John's Gospel, The position of the Sudarium in relation to the shroud tells us that it had been taken off before the shroud was used. There are similar arguments when we talk about the shroud. A coincidence that normally goes unnoticed is therefore brought into the spotlight. The dead bodies of each cloth have never been found. This coincidence is only coherent if the body was that of Jesus of Nazareth. Another possibility, remote and illogical, would be the faking of the Oviedo cloth contrary to the ideas of the time and despite the lack of knowledge of the physiopathological processes involved. The Oviedo cloth could not have been placed between the face and the shroud, as if it had been, the image on the shroud would not have been formed. So in the case of Jesus of Nazareth, we have this double coincidence: unusual use of the cloth called a Sudarium, and the disappearance of the body it was used on. Neither the shroud nor the Sudarium have ever been connected to any body other than that of Jesus of Nazareth. Consequently, we can say that the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo provide information that agrees perfectly with the shroud and Sudarium mentioned by the Gospel. The only negative element is the carbon-14 dating, which causes discrepancies in the case of both cloths. This contradiction, in our opinion, makes the results of the carbon-14 dating very difficult to interpret, because even if the body in question is not that of Jesus of Nazareth, we do not see how it can be affirmed that the two cloths did not cover the same body. This immediately throws the carbon-14 dating out by 7 centuries. Apart from the agreement with the cloths mentioned in the Gospel, from the archaeological point of view, the two cloths provide us with very valuable information, both in quantity and quality, about the processes followed for a crucified corpse wrapped in this manner in accordance with the funeral rites and customs of Palestine 2,000 years ago. This information cannot be faked. The exceptional circumstances of this case enable us to connect it with Jesus of Nazareth. No other corpse has been identified as the cause of the stains and images analyzed in this paper. Final comments. As a final comment, we can say that the studies carried out up to now on the Oviedo Sudarium have brought to light the information contained in the cloth, which is both extremely interesting and important. As we have said many times, the Sudarium Domini covered the head of a dead body that had died in conditions totally compatible with those of crucifixion. The man in question had been previously wounded to such an extent as to have his hair, top of the back, and the parts of the chest and neck that the Sudarium touched and covered with blood. This is what the cloth tells us. If we add to this the fact that the cloth has always been associated with Jesus of Nazareth, we can say that everything we've found up to now is at least perfectly coherent with what presumably happened to Jesus in the Passion and death on the cross. The Oviedo cloth is in itself a document worthy of in-depth study. It is possible that we are only now beginning to uncover all of the information contained therein, so in the same way that we discovered that the body had been unexpectedly placed on its right side, we might find other things that help us to understand better what happened to the body of Jesus from an hour after his death on the cross, when the cloth was placed on his face, up till the time when it was taken off, so that the body could be wrapped, in all probability, in the Shroud of Turin. The idea that the Sudarium of Oviedo might be that of Jesus of Nazareth means that the investigation of the cloth should be placed in context. To do this, it is essential to relate it to other documents that describe the circumstance of those times. Such too is the case of the shroud and its geographical surroundings in Jerusalem. From the comparison of the two cloths, it seems that there's a coincidence that necessarily catches the attention of anyone who studies them in depth. It is clear that different faces can produce very similar stains, and that the simple macroscopic inspection of the stains on these two cloths can only lead us to deduce that it is worth continuing the investigation. More definite information is that while the stains on each face apparently coincide reasonably well with those of the back of the head coincide too, and the blood type is also the same in both cases. Stains of blood shed in life coincide with stains of blood shed in life, and those of post-mortem blood with their counterparts, the blood coming out of the right-hand side of the mouth, the shape of the beard and forehead. All of the stains caused by sharp objects on the nape of the neck and the Sudarium fit in perfect with those in the same area on the shroud, both being blood shed in life. This is without doubt an unexpected coincidence. Ricci could not see it as a consequence of his mistake about which part of the Sudarium was in direct contact with the face, and one that reveals much. There is no other known case of a crucifixion where the victim was previously crowned with thorns. Jackson's hypothesis about the formation of the shroud image and the sideways movement of the stains described by Lavoie and Adler exist on the corresponding stains on the Sudarium on the left front. This too is unexpected, as neither Lavoie, Adler, nor Jackson knew the Sudarium in depth, so they were not looking for preconceived coincidences while ignoring reality. Anyone who observes the cloths will immediately perceive this. It is another question to know how to identify and evaluate it. This means as in-depth study of how the cloths were placed, which in turn means time and interest, as the majority of information we have worked with is not immediately evident. The Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo are two cloths that should be studied together without forgetting the individual value of each. The information obtained from one can be used to interpret the other. We think this work should be of interest to any student of the person we now call the historical Jesus, because, as we have already said on many occasions, these cloths may be documents that provide extraordinary information about the fundamental details of the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth. These two cloths could well be the ones found by Mary Magdalene when the first day of the week was dawning. From Valencia, España, June 1998.